something is about to end that Microsoft has been offering for nearly 4 years, and that the overwhelming majority of Windows 10 users who have not yet made a decision about Windows 11 have been treating as a permanent option that would remain available whenever they eventually got around to evaluating it. The free upgrade to Windows 11 ends on June 30th, not as a soft deadline that Microsoft will quietly extend, as it has extended prior Windows upgrade deadlines when user adoption fell short of projections. Not as a provisional end date subject to revision based on how the transition period proceeds, as a confirmed, publicly documented, organizationally committed termination date for the upgrade pathway that has been available to qualifying Windows 10 hardware at no additional cost since Windows 11's launch in October 2021. After June 30th, users who have not upgraded and who want Windows 11 will face a purchase requirement whose pricing Microsoft has not yet formally announced for the post-free period market, but whose historical precedent from prior Windows version transitions suggests will be significant enough that the decision to defer past June 30th is a decision with real financial consequences that the current availability of the free upgrade does not impose. This deadline creates a decision that every Windows 10 user on qualifying hardware needs to make before June 30th, and that the existence of a deadline does not automatically mean should be made in favor of upgrading simply because the upgrade is free and the free period is ending. The urgency of the deadline is real. The decision it requires is not simple. And the answer that Microsoft's promotional communications about the deadline consistently push Windows 10 users toward, which is to upgrade immediately to avoid missing the free offer, is not the answer that serves every Windows 10 user's actual interests once that answer is evaluated against everything that this series of coverage has documented about what Windows 11 actually does on users' machines in its default configuration. There is something specific you should do before June 30th. What that something is depends on a clear-eyed assessment of your specific situation, your hardware, your computing needs, your privacy priorities, and your tolerance for the surveillance architecture that Windows 11's default configuration operates. The answer is not uniformly upgrade before the deadline for every Windows 10 user any more than it is uniformly do not upgrade for every Windows 10 user. The answer requires honest evaluation of what upgrading actually means for your specific circumstances, conducted against a complete description of what Windows 11 is, rather than against the promotional description that Microsoft's deadline urgency messaging is designed to substitute for that complete description. Here is exactly what the June 30th deadline means in technical and commercial terms, and what specifically changes for Windows 10 users who miss it. Here is what the Windows 10 end of support timeline means for users who decide not to upgrade, and what their options are in the period between the upgrade deadline and Windows 10's final support date. Here is what upgrading to Windows 11 on your specific hardware will actually produce in terms of both the user-facing feature changes and the surveillance architecture changes that your machine's relationship with Microsoft will undergo at the moment the Windows 11 installation completes. Here's the hardware reality for users whose machines do not meet Windows 11's requirements and what their actual options are beyond the binary choice between upgrading and staying on an eventually unsupported Windows 10. Here is what the Linux transition option looks like, specifically for Windows 10 users, facing this deadline, whose prior coverage in this series has established the context to evaluate properly. Here is why the June 30th deadline is also a significant strategic moment for Microsoft, rather than purely an administrative update schedule transition. And here's precisely what actions you should take before June 30th, depending on which of the 4 distinct user situations this deadline creates you specifically occupy. The June 30th free upgrade deadline represents the conclusion of an upgrade offer period whose length reflects Microsoft's difficulty achieving the Windows 11 adoption rate that its strategic plans required, rather than a planned generous offer period that Microsoft always intended to maintain through mid-2025. Windows 11 launched with hardware requirements that immediately created a large population of qualifying hardware users who could upgrade at no cost, and a larger population of users whose machines did not meet the requirements at all. The free upgrade offer was designed to drive rapid adoption among the qualifying hardware population in ways that would establish Windows 11's installed base at a scale sufficient to sustain its commercial AI and advertising infrastructure with the behavioral data volume that infrastructure requires at commercial viability. The adoption rate did not proceed at the pace Microsoft's planning had assumed. Windows 10 retained its market share lead over Windows 11 for longer than any prior Windows version transition had allowed its predecessor to maintain dominance. Users on qualifying hardware who were offered a free upgrade declined it at rates that Microsoft's historical upgrade transition data had not prepared its planning teams to expect. The extension of the free upgrade period beyond its initially communicated availability, extending multiple times through the 4 years since Windows 11's launch, reflects Microsoft's successive reassessments of adoption rate, shortfalls, and successive decisions to maintain the free upgrade incentive rather than accepting the adoption ceiling that ending it would have produced. The June 30th deadline is different from prior deadline extensions because the commercial and strategic context that would justify another extension is no longer present in the way it was present during prior extension decisions. Windows 11's market share has grown to the point where its commercial AI and behavioral data infrastructure is operational at viable scale, regardless of whether remaining Windows 10 holdouts upgrade before their support period ends. Microsoft's Windows 12 planning, whose leaked internal documents prior coverage has examined in detail, operates on a timeline that requires Windows 11 to have consolidated its installed base sufficiently to provide the foundation for Windows 12's commercial architecture deployment. The June 30th deadline reflects a strategic determination that the free upgrade incentive has reached the point of diminishing returns relative to the commercial cost of maintaining it and the precedent-setting implications of indefinitely extending what was positioned as a time-limited offer. The practical meaning of the June 30th deadline for Windows 10 users on qualifying hardware is straightforward in its commercial dimension. After June 30th, upgrading from Windows 10 to Windows 11 will require either purchasing a Windows 11 license at retail pricing or purchasing new hardware that comes with Windows 11 pre-installed. The OEM licensing pathway that historically represents how most consumers acquired new Windows versions. Microsoft has not published specific post-free period Windows 11 retail pricing for consumer purchases, but the historical pricing structure for Windows consumer licenses suggests pricing in the range that makes the free upgrade's absence a genuinely meaningful financial consideration rather than a nominal one. The Windows 10 end of support date is October 14th, 2025, which creates a timeline tension that the June 30th upgrade deadline intersects with in ways that are important for Windows 10 users to understand clearly. Windows 10 will continue functioning after October 14th, 2025, exactly as it functions before that date, with no change to the operating system's capabilities or performance. What ends on October 14th is Microsoft's commitment to providing security updates that address newly discovered vulnerabilities in Windows 10's components. After end of support, Windows 10 machines will not receive patches for security vulnerabilities discovered after that date, meaning that the security exposure of those machines will grow over time as unpatched vulnerabilities accumulate in an operating system that Microsoft is no longer maintaining. The security implications of running an unsupported operating system are real and should be evaluated honestly, rather than either dismissed as acceptable risk or exaggerated as immediate catastrophic danger. The practical security risk of running Windows 10 after end of support depends significantly on how a machine is used, what network environment it operates in, what security software is deployed on it, and how quickly newly discovered vulnerabilities in Windows 10 components are likely to be weaponized by the threat actors targeting consumer machines. Users who run machines in controlled environments, employ capable security software, and exercise reasonable browsing and download hygiene face a different risk profile than users who operate machines in high-risk environments without security tooling. Neither assessment changes the fact that running an unsupported operating system creates a security exposure trajectory that gets worse over time rather than remaining stable. The June 30th upgrade deadline, therefore, sits within a broader timeline that gives Windows 10 users approximately 3.5 months between the upgrade deadline and Windows 10's end of support date, during which upgrading to Windows 11 is still possible but no longer free, and after which the security exposure of remaining on Windows 10 begins accumulating without the mitigation of Microsoft's security update support. This timeline structure means that Windows 10 users who miss the June 30th free upgrade deadline retain the option of purchasing a Windows 11 upgrade until Windows 10's end of support, paying the retail price that the post-free period will require, and that users who want neither to pay for Windows 11 nor to remain on an unsupported Windows 10 need to have evaluated and begun transitioning to alternatives. Before October 14th creates the urgency that the free upgrade period's end will have produced at a lower intensity level starting July 1st. The hardware qualification reality for the Windows 10 user population creates a division that the June 30th deadline affects differently depending on which side of that division a given user falls. Users whose machines meet Windows 11's hardware requirements, specifically the TPM2. 0 secure boot capable UEFI, and supported processor generation requirements that Windows 11's specification mandates face the decision about whether to use the free upgrade before June 30th or pay for it after, with the Linux alternative as a third option. Users whose machines do not meet Windows 11's hardware requirements face a different situation, where the June 30th deadline is not directly relevant to their upgrade pathway, because the free upgrade was never available to their hardware regardless of deadline, and whose decision is between remaining on Windows 10 through and beyond end of support purchasing new hardware, or transitioning to Linux on their existing hardware. The population of Windows 10 users on hardware that does not meet Windows 11's requirements is larger than Microsoft's public communications about the Windows 11 transition have acknowledged clearly. Independent hardware inventory research estimates that between 30 and 40% of currently active Windows 10 machines fall outside Windows 11's hardware requirements, representing hundreds of millions of machines whose users are not facing a free upgrade or pay later decision, but are rather facing a Windows 10 end-of-support timeline on hardware that Microsoft has officially declared incompatible with its current operating system generation. For this population, the June 30th deadline is irrelevant to their upgrade options, but highly relevant as a marker that the broader Windows support transition timeline is advancing in ways that make hardware and platform decisions increasingly urgent. The decision that qualifying hardware Windows 10 users face before June 30th requires honest engagement with what upgrading to Windows 11 actually means for their machine's behavior, rather than with Microsoft's promotional framing of the upgrade as a straightforward improvement over Windows 10 that delivers better security, better AI features, and a more modern computing experience. All of those promotional descriptions contain genuine truth. Windows 11 does include security architecture improvements over Windows 10 in specific components. It does include AI features that Windows 10 does not have. Its interface is more current than Windows 10's in specific design language dimensions. What the promotional framing does not describe is the surveillance architecture that those improvements and features are delivered on top of, and that represents the dimension of Windows 11 that this series of coverage has been documenting across many consecutive disclosures. Upgrading from Windows 10 to Windows 11 on qualifying hardware does not only deliver interface improvements, security enhancements, and AI features, it delivers the full Windows 11 surveillance architecture in its default enabled state on hardware that was previously running Windows 10's comparatively more limited data collection infrastructure. The behavioral AI monitoring, the nightly data transmission sessions, the clipboard recording and synchronization, the file sense content analysis, the OneDrive folder backup file, synchronization, the telemetry rollback mechanism that progressively restores default collection settings after users disable them, and the monthly performance degradation from commercial background infrastructure expansion are all components that Windows 10 users will be enrolled in at the moment their Windows 11 upgrade completes and their machine reboots into its new operating system configuration. This is not an argument against upgrading. It is an argument for upgrading with full information about what the upgrade entails, so that users who choose to upgrade can immediately apply the comprehensive hardening configuration that prior coverage has documented as necessary for managing Windows 11's surveillance architecture, rather than discovering its existence months later through privacy disclosures and feeling retrospectively deceived about what they agreed to. Users who upgrade to Windows 11 while simultaneously applying the comprehensive hardening configuration that disables the surveillance architecture's default enabled components are in a better position than users who remain on Windows 10 past its end of support date because they receive Windows 11's genuine security improvements, gain forward compatibility with the application ecosystem that will progressively shift toward Windows 11 compatibility assumptions, and have addressed the surveillance architecture before it has operated on their machine for an extended period rather than after. The comprehensive hardening that Windows 11 requires immediately upon installation to address the default enabled surveillance components involves the processes that this series has documented in detail across multiple previous pieces. Disabling the connected user experiences and telemetry service and setting it to disabled startup type through the services management console. Disabling all customer experience improvement program, application experience, and behavioral data collection scheduled tasks through Task Scheduler. Setting wake timers to disabled in Power Options, advanced settings to prevent nightly data transmission wakes, stopping OneDrive folder backup for desktop, documents, and pictures, and unlinking the PC from OneDrive. If cloud file synchronization is not a deliberate personal choice, disabling clipboard history and removing cloud synchronization of clipboard data, turning off online speech recognition and reviewing all microphone access permissions, disabling the advertising ID through privacy and security general settings, applying the full O&O Shutup 10++, recommended settings configuration to address privacy components that Windows settings does not expose clearly. And for Pro and Enterprise users, applying group policy enforcement for telemetry, AI features, Copilot, and Windows Search Cloud processing that provides update-resistant enforcement of the privacy configuration. This hardening configuration, applied immediately upon Windows 11 installation before the machine is used for normal computing, produces a Windows 11 installation that delivers the operating system's genuine user-facing improvements while preventing its surveillance architecture from operating in the default configuration that Microsoft designed it to operate in. The hardening requires approximately 90 minutes to apply completely on initial. installation, and approximately 15 minutes for post-update verification and restoration of any settings that Update Infrastructure has attempted to restore to default configurations. The Linux option that this series has been building toward as an alternative for users who find Windows 11's surveillance architecture unacceptable, regardless of how thoroughly it is hardened, deserves specific framing in the context of the June 30th deadline, because the deadline creates a natural decision point that is also an optimal transition window for users who have been considering the Linux alternative but have been deferring the evaluation. The June 30th deadline provides the external impetus that converts consideration into action for many users who would not have committed to a Linux evaluation timeline without a specific deadline, creating concrete urgency. Users whose hardware does not meet Windows 11's requirements are in the optimal position for Linux transition evaluation because their hardware situation eliminates the upgrade option without eliminating the alternative computing option. A machine that Windows 11 will not run is a machine that Linux Mint will run, frequently faster and more responsively than Windows 10 was running on the same hardware before the transition. Because Linux Mint's absence of the commercial background infrastructure that Windows 11 carries allows it to deliver the machine's full hardware capability to user computing, rather than distributing it between user computing and Microsoft's commercial operations. The machines that Microsoft's hardware requirements have declared too old for Windows 11 are machines that are not too old for computing. They are machines that Microsoft's commercial AI architecture has declared commercially inadequate for its data. Collection requirements, a declaration that is relevant to Microsoft's commercial interests and irrelevant to the machine's actual computing capability for the tasks their users need them to perform. Users whose hardware qualifies for Windows 11, but who have been following this series and have concluded that Windows 11's surveillance architecture represents a computing relationship they are not willing to participate in even with comprehensive hardening, have the June 30th deadline as the natural transition catalyst that makes the cost-benefit calculation for Linux transition most favorable. The free upgrade period's end means that the financial cost of moving to Windows 11 in the future increases, which increases the relative attractiveness of the free Linux alternative at exactly the moment when the deadline creates decision urgency. Users who transition to Linux Mint before June 30th avoid both the future Windows 11 purchase cost and the surveillance architecture that Windows 11 delivers on hardware they own free of both financial and privacy obligations to Microsoft's commercial ecosystem. The Linux Mint transition process for Windows 10 users benefits from specific guidance that addresses the Windows 10 to Linux Mint pathway rather than the Windows 11 to Linux Mint pathway that prior coverage addressed, because Windows 10 users are transitioning from an operating system whose application ecosystem and user interface conventions are more similar to Linux Mint's Cinnamon Desktop than Windows 11's Fluent Design interface is. Windows 10 users who have never used Windows 11 will find Linux Mint's Cinnamon Desktop more familiar in its structural organization than Windows 11 users would, because Windows Mint's taskbar at bottom, start menu at left corner layout matches Windows 10's interface conventions more closely than it matches Windows 11's centered taskbar layout. Download Linux Mint 21. 3, or the most current release from Linux Mint. COM and create a bootable USB drive using Etcher, Rufus, or the Balena Etcher tool that is available from Balena. I/O. Boot from the USB drive using your machine's boot menu, which is accessible by pressing the manufacturer-specific key during startup, typically F12 for Dell and Lenovo, F9 for HP, and Delete or F2 for Asus machines, and selecting the USB drive as the boot device. Use the Try Linux Mint option rather than the Install option to run Linux Mint from the USB drive without committing to installation, which provides a complete preview of the Linux Mint environment on your specific hardware to verify compatibility before making any permanent changes. Use the Try environment for 2 to 4 hours performing normal computing tasks to assess how Linux Mint performs on your hardware and how well your essential applications are available in native Linux versions or through browser-based alternatives. If the Try environment assessment is positive, proceed to installation using the Install Linux Mint desktop icon and select the option to install alongside Windows rather than replacing it, which creates a dual boot configuration that preserves your Windows installation for applications requiring Windows access while establishing Linux Mint as your primary computing environment. The dual boot approach eliminates the irreversibility concern that prevents many users from committing to Linux transition by ensuring that Windows remains accessible for the specific applications that have not yet found Linux replacements in your workflow. The application availability assessment that Windows 10 users need to complete before committing to Linux transition is best conducted through the ProtonDB compatibility database for gaming applications and through the Ubuntu package repository search for productivity and utility applications. The vast majority of browser-based applications that represent an increasing proportion of modern workflows run identically on Linux Mint's Firefox or Chrome browsers as on Windows, meaning the application gap that prior generations of Linux adoption faced has narrowed substantially for users whose workflows are primarily browser-dependent. The applications most likely to represent genuine transition blockers are professional software with Windows-exclusive implementations, specifically certain Adobe Creative Cloud applications, specialized professional productivity software, and some enterprise line-of-business applications that IT departments have not yet evaluated Linux compatibility for. The dual boot transition strategy addresses the application compatibility concern by preserving Windows access during the transition period rather than requiring complete Linux commitment before application compatibility has been fully assessed. Users who install Linux Mint alongside Windows 10 before June 30th preserve their Windows 10 installation in a supported state through October 14th, 2025, giving them 3.5 months of dual boot operation to identify and resolve any application. Compatibility gaps before Windows 10's end of support creates pressure to fully complete the Linux transition. The specific actions that each of the 4 distinct user situations the June 30th deadline creates should involve are worth articulating directly rather than requiring users to extract them from the analytical discussion above. Users on qualifying hardware who have decided to upgrade to Windows 11 should upgrade before June 30th to take advantage of the free offer and should apply the comprehensive hardening configuration documented in this series within the first session after the upgrade completes. Download the Windows 11 Installation Assistant from Microsoft's website and run it to initiate the upgrade. After the upgrade completes and the machine reboots into Windows 11, open a browser and review the prior coverage of this series for the complete hardening checklist, applying every documented setting change, service disabling, and scheduled task disabling before using the machine for normal computing activities. Download O&O Shutup 10++ and apply its recommended settings configuration as the final step of the initial hardening session. Establish the post-update verification habit that checks and restores hardening settings after each major Windows update. Users on qualifying hardware who have decided not to upgrade to Windows 11, regardless of whether the upgrade is free or paid, who have assessed Windows 11's surveillance architecture as incompatible with the computing relationship they want to have with their machine, should use the time before June 30th to evaluate the Linux Mint transition and begin the dual boot installation process that preserves Windows 10 access during the transition period. Following the Linux Mint installation process documented above, establish the dual boot configuration and begin using Linux Mint for the primary computing activities that represent your daily workflow, reserving the Windows 10 boot for the specific applications that require Windows access, while their Linux replacements are identified and assessed. Users on hardware that does not meet Windows 11's requirements have the clearest case for immediate Linux Mint evaluation because their hardware situation eliminates the Windows 11 option entirely. It makes continuing on Windows 10 a declining security proposition that requires a long-term platform plan. Download and install Linux Mint in dual boot configuration following the process above, conduct the application compatibility assessment, and plan the full Linux Mint transition to be complete before October 14th, 2025, so that Windows 10's end of support date arrives on a machine that has already established Linux Mint as its primary operating system, rather than arriving as an emergency forcing function. Users who are genuinely undecided about whether to upgrade to Windows 11 or transition to Linux should use the period before June 30th to conduct a structured evaluation of both options, rather than deferring the decision until deadline pressure makes thoughtful evaluation impossible. Install Linux Mint in try-mode from USB on the current machine to assess its fit for the specific hardware and workflow. Simultaneously, research Windows 11's current state using this series and other independent technical sources, rather than Microsoft's promotional materials. Make the evaluation decision based on which option better serves the specific computing relationship that serves your actual needs, rather than based on which option Microsoft's deadline urgency messaging most effectively creates pressure toward. The broader strategic significance of June 30th for Microsoft goes beyond the administrative completion of the Windows 11 transition period into territory that reflects what the deadline accomplishes for Windows 12's commercial architecture deployment. The users who upgrade before June 30th become the base from which Windows 12's commercial launch begins, a base whose behavioral data has been flowing through Windows 11's surveillance architecture for the period they have been running it, and whose subscription conversion to Windows 12's paid feature tiers benefits from the familiarity with Windows 11 features that the upgrade period has been building. The users who decline the free upgrade and either pay for Windows 11 later or transition to alternatives represent the population whose decisions about Windows platforms will shape the competitive context that Windows 12 launches into, a context whose character Microsoft's June 30th deadline is partly designed to influence by creating upgrade urgency before the Windows 12 narrative, becomes the primary frame through which platform decisions are evaluated. This strategic dimension does not change the practical decision framework that individual users should apply to the June 30th deadline. It does provide context for why Microsoft is communicating deadline urgency with the specific intensity it is deploying, and why the urgency communication is structured around the financial cost of missing the free period rather than around the comprehensive description of what Windows 11 actually is that would allow users to make genuinely informed decisions about whether Windows 11 is what they want their machines to become. The final warning framing that the title applies to this deadline is appropriate, not primarily because the upgrade deadline itself represents a threat that must be avoided at all costs, but because the deadline creates a specific and time-limited window in which the decision about your computing platform for the next several years is most advantageously made. The warning is against making that decision by default rather than by choice, which is what happens when users defer the evaluation until the deadline is passed and the options available to them have changed in ways that serve Microsoft's interests rather than theirs. If you upgrade to Windows 11 before June 30th without applying the comprehensive hardening that controls its surveillance architecture, you will have made the decision that Microsoft's promotional messaging was designed to produce, while the privacy and performance implications of that decision remain invisible to you until subsequent disclosures in the series. This piece is part of to reach you and inform you retroactively about what your upgrade enrolled you in. If you defer the evaluation past June 30th without having made a conscious platform decision, you will have made Microsoft's preferred decision by default, while believing you have simply not yet gotten around to deciding, a state of affairs that serves Microsoft's transition timeline while costing you the financial benefit of the free upgrade and the clarity of the informed decision that the deadline window provides. If you use the time before June 30th to make an honest, complete, information-based assessment of your platform options and act on that assessment with whatever combination of Windows 11 upgrade plus hardening or Linux Mint transition best serves your specific situation, you will have done the thing that Microsoft's deadline urgency messaging is specifically designed to prevent you from having time to do, which is to think clearly about what you actually want your computing to be and to make the decision that produces it rather than the decision that produces Microsoft's preferred outcome. June 30th is the deadline. The decision is yours. The options are specific. The information this series has provided is complete enough to make the decision informed rather than reactive. Do the thing before the deadline that serves your interests, rather than the thing the deadline pressure is designed to make you do by default. Because July 1st arrives with whatever decision you made before it, and undoing a poor platform decision costs substantially more than the time making a good one requires. The deadline is real. The urgency is legitimate. The decision it creates deserves the time and information that this piece and this series have been providing. Use both before June 30th, because after June 30th, the cost of the options changes. And the surveillance architecture you choose for your computing life does not change its behavior based on whether you understood it when you chose it. It operates regardless. Address it before it operates on your machine for another day, without your informed understanding of what it is doing and why. That is the real final warning. And the deadline for acting on it is the same deadline Microsoft printed on its promotional materials for entirely different reasons. June 30th. Do this before it is gone.